The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Buckingham Palace as security teams made their final preparations. It was going to be one of those days that would be remembered for years to come, though not necessarily for the reasons anyone expected. The American delegation was arriving for what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic visit, but nothing involving the Trump family ever seemed to go according to plan. Donald Trump Jr. stepped out of the black sedan, his confident stride betraying none of the nervousness that his security detail had noticed during the ride from the hotel. At 36, he had grown accustomed to the spotlight that came with bearing his father's name. But this was different. This wasn't a business meeting in Manhattan or a campaign rally in Ohio. This was the British royal family, an institution that had weathered centuries of political storms and social upheavals. The younger Trump had insisted on handling this particular diplomatic engagement personally. His father, then serving as president, had other pressing matters to attend to, and Don Jr. had volunteered to represent the family interests. It seemed like a perfect opportunity to demonstrate his diplomatic skills and perhaps gain some international credibility that could serve him well in future political endeavors. As he approached the palace entrance, Don Jr. couldn't help but feel a surge of American pride mixed with something that felt uncomfortably like intimidation. The building before him had housed kings and queens since 1703, had survived 2 world wars, and had witnessed the rise and fall of the British Empire. For a moment, he wondered if his usual approach of casual confidence might need some adjustment. The British protocol officers had been very clear about the procedures during the briefing 3 days earlier. There would be a formal inspection of the Queen's Guard, followed by a private audience with several members of the royal family, and then a state dinner with carefully selected dignitaries. Every step had been choreographed with the precision that only centuries of royal tradition could produce. Captain James Whitmore of the Grenadier Guards stood at attention near the palace gates, his red uniform immaculate and his bearskin hat perfectly positioned. At 28, he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been selected for the Queen's Guard based on his exemplary service record. Today's duty was supposed to be ceremonial, a welcome change from the dangers he had faced overseas. The captain had received his orders that morning from Colonel Richardson, who had seemed unusually stressed about the American visit. "Remember, Whitmore," the colonel had said, adjusting his own uniform nervously. "These Americans sometimes have different expectations about protocol. Just follow standard procedures and everything should go smoothly." As Don Jr. approached, Captain Whitmore could see the American's eyes taking in every detail of the ceremonial setup. The guards stood in perfect formation, their rifles held at precisely the correct angle, their faces maintaining the stoic expression that had become legendary around the world. Everything was exactly as it should be according to centuries of British military tradition. What Captain Whitmore couldn't know was that Don Jr. had spent the previous evening watching old newsreels of his father's previous visits to various world leaders. He had noticed how other dignitaries had been received, how military honors were presented, and most importantly, how soldiers had saluted visiting American officials. In his mind, he had constructed an image of how his own reception should unfold. The problem was that Don Jr.'s understanding of international protocol was filtered through his experience of American military customs, where visiting dignitaries often did receive salutes from honor guards. He had never quite grasped that the British system operated under different rules, with different traditions, and most crucially, different chains of command. As he drew closer to the formation of guards, Don Jr. felt a familiar surge of the confidence that had carried him through countless business negotiations and public appearances. He had inherited more than just his father's name. He had inherited a particular view of how the world should work, one where Trump family members commanded respect and deference wherever they went. The British security detail flanking the American visitor exchanged subtle glances. They had been briefed on the Trump family's sometimes unconventional approach to diplomacy, but they had also been assured that this visit would follow standard protocols. The younger Trump had seemed reasonable enough during the preliminary meetings, and there was no reason to expect any departure from established procedures. Captain Whitmore noticed the American's pace slowing as he approached the guard formation. This wasn't unusual. Many visiting dignitaries took a moment to appreciate the precision and pageantry of the Queen's Guard. What was unusual was the particular expression on the American's face. a look that combined appreciation with something that looked almost like expectation. The morning breeze carried the sounds of London traffic beyond the palace walls, but within the ceremonial grounds an almost perfect silence prevailed. The guards maintained their positions with the discipline that had made them famous, while the various officials and security personnel waited for the formal proceedings to begin, according to the carefully planned schedule. Don Jr. paused directly in front of Captain Whitmore, taking in the perfect military bearing and the impressive uniform that represented centuries of British military tradition. For a moment he seemed to be weighing something in his mind, perhaps remembering the briefings about proper protocol, or perhaps thinking about the image he wanted to project for the cameras that were discreetly positioned around the ceremonial area. The moment stretched on just a bit longer than would typically be comfortable, with the American visitor standing before the British soldier, both men representing their respective countries and the complex relationship between two allied nations. Neither could have predicted that this seemingly routine encounter was about to become something that would be discussed in diplomatic circles for years to come. What happened next would test not only the training and discipline of a career British soldier, but also the delicate balance of international diplomacy and the weight of centuries-old traditions that governed behavior within the walls of one of the world's most famous palaces. Don Jr. straightened his shoulders and fixed Captain Whitmore with what he clearly believed was an authoritative gaze. The American had made his decision, and with the confidence that had been bred into him from childhood, he spoke in a clear, commanding voice that carried across the ceremonial grounds. "Soldier, give me a salute." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge to centuries of British military protocol. Captain Whitmore's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but this particular moment had never been covered in any manual or briefing session. His face remained perfectly composed, but behind his professional exterior, his mind was racing through the implications of what he had just heard. For a British soldier, the chain of command was not just an organizational chart. It was the foundation upon which military discipline rested. The Queen's Guard saluted members of the royal family, superior officers within the British military hierarchy, and certain designated officials according to very specific protocols that had been refined over generations. An American civilian, regardless of his family connections or political prominence, simply did not fit into that carefully structured system. The British protocol officers who had been standing nearby felt their carefully planned day beginning to slip away from them. Sir Reginald Pemberton, who had overseen royal visits for nearly 2 decades, felt a familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded diplomatic incidents. He had seen this kind of cultural misunderstanding before, but never quite so publicly, and never involving someone whose actions might reflect on the highest levels of both governments. Don Jr. waited, his expression showing a mixture of expectation and growing surprise that his command had not been immediately followed. In his experience, military personnel typically responded to clear directions with prompt compliance, especially when those directions came from someone representing American interests. The silence that followed his request was beginning to feel uncomfortable, and he could sense the attention of everyone present focusing on this unexpected moment. Captain Whitmore found himself in an impossible position. His military oath bound him to follow the commands of his superior officers and to show respect for the crown and its representatives. An American visitor, no matter how prominent, had no authority to command a British soldier to perform military honors. To comply would violate every principle of military discipline he had sworn to uphold. To refuse directly, however, might create an international incident that could have consequences far beyond this single moment. The other guards in the formation remained perfectly still, but each was acutely aware that something unusual was happening. Their training had taught them to maintain their positions regardless of distractions, but the tension in the air was palpable. They had all heard the Americans' command, and they all understood that their colleague was facing a situation that would require careful navigation. Sir Reginald stepped forward, his diplomatic instincts finally overriding his shock at the situation. "Mr. Trump," he said in the carefully modulated tone that British diplomats had perfected over centuries of international negotiations, "perhaps we might proceed with the scheduled inspection of the Guard. Her Majesty's representatives are waiting to begin the formal ceremonies." But Don Jr. was not easily deflected. He had grown up in a world where persistence and determination were valued above diplomatic niceties. and he had clearly decided that this was a matter of principle. "I asked the soldier for a salute," he repeated, his voice carrying a note of irritation that suggested he was not accustomed to having his requests go unfulfilled. Captain Whitmore spoke for the first time since the American delegation had arrived. His voice was steady and professional, but those who knew military bearing could hear the strain beneath the surface. "Sir, I salute according to British military protocol and the orders of my commanding officers. I am not authorized to render military honors except as prescribed by regulations." The response was perfectly correct, diplomatically phrased, and completely inflexible. It was the kind of answer that reflected the training and discipline that had made the British military respected around the world. But it was also exactly the kind of response that was likely to escalate rather than diffuse the situation. Don Jr.'s face showed a flash of something that could have been surprise, anger, or simple disbelief. He was clearly accustomed to a world where his requests were accommodated, where his family name opened doors and commanded deference. The polite but firm refusal from the British soldier was apparently not something he had anticipated or prepared for. "Do you know who I am?" The question came out with a sharpness that cut through the diplomatic atmosphere like a blade. It was the kind of question that revealed more about the speaker than about the situation, a phrase that suggested someone unaccustomed to having their authority questioned or their identity overlooked. Captain Whitmore's response was immediate and perfectly respectful. "Yes, sir. You are Mr. Donald Trump, Jr., representing the American government on this visit. However, my duties and responsibilities are defined by British military regulations and the orders of my superior officers." The exchange was beginning to draw the attention of palace staff and security, personnel who had not initially been part of the ceremonial proceedings. Word was spreading quickly through the professional networks that kept royal events running smoothly. And senior officials were beginning to realize that what should have been a routine diplomatic courtesy was becoming something significantly more complicated. Don Jr. looked around at the faces surrounding him, perhaps finally beginning to realize that his usual methods of asserting authority were not going to work in this particular environment. The British system, with its layers of tradition and protocol, was not designed to accommodate the kind of direct, personal approach that had served him well in business and political settings. The morning sun continued to shine down on the palace grounds, but the atmosphere had shifted from ceremonial anticipation to diplomatic tension. What had begun as a simple cultural misunderstanding was evolving into a test of competing principles: American directness versus British protocol, personal authority versus institutional tradition, and the delicate balance of international relations. As the silence stretched on, everyone present understood that the next few moments would determine whether this incident would be quietly resolved or become the kind of diplomatic embarrassment that would be remembered long after the official ceremonies had been forgotten. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Don Jr. processed Captain Whitmore's polite but firm refusal. For someone who had grown up believing that the Trump name commanded universal respect and immediate compliance, this moment represented something entirely foreign to his experience. His jaw tightened visibly as he struggled to maintain his composure in front of the growing audience of British officials and security personnel. "Let me make this very clear," Don Jr. said, his voice taking on the kind of edge that suggested he was moving from request to demand. "My father is the President of the United States. America and Britain are allies. When I ask for a simple show of military courtesy, I expect it to be provided without argument." The statement revealed both his fundamental misunderstanding of how military protocol worked outside America and his growing frustration with a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. What he intended as an assertion of legitimate authority was coming across as something much less diplomatic, and the British officials present were beginning to exchange the kind of subtle glances that preceded serious diplomatic incidents. Captain Whitmore remained at attention, but his fellow guards could see the slight tension in his shoulders that indicated the strain he was under. He had been placed in an impossible position by someone who clearly didn't understand the implications of what he was asking. To salute would be to acknowledge an authority that didn't exist within the British system. To continue refusing risked escalating an already delicate situation. Sir Reginald Pemberton was frantically trying to think of a way to diffuse the confrontation without causing offense to either party. His decades of diplomatic experience had taught him that these kinds of cultural misunderstandings could either be laughed off as minor curiosities or could explode into major international embarrassments, depending entirely on how they were handled in the crucial first few minutes. "Mr. Trump," Sir Reginald ventured carefully, "perhaps we might move forward with the planned inspection. I'm certain that once we've completed the formal ceremonies, there will be ample opportunity to discuss any questions about protocol with the appropriate military liaisons." But Don Jr. was clearly not in the mood for diplomatic deflection. His business background had taught him that when faced with resistance, the answer was usually to apply more pressure until the opposition yielded. He had not yet grasped that this particular situation operated according to completely different rules. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable here," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "This is basic military courtesy. In America, soldiers salute visiting dignitaries all the time. Are you telling me that British soldiers are less professional than American ones?" The comment hit like a slap across the face to every British military person within earshot. Captain Whitmore's expression remained perfectly controlled, but his fellow guards noticed the slight stiffening of his posture that indicated how the slight had been received. Questioning the professionalism of the Queen's Guard was not just an insult. It was an attack on an institution that had earned its reputation through centuries of distinguished service. Colonel Richardson, who had been observing from a distance, finally decided that the situation required his direct intervention. He approached with the measured stride of a career military officer who had dealt with difficult situations before, but even he seemed somewhat taken aback by the unexpected turn the morning had taken. "Mr. Trump," the colonel said, in a voice that carried the authority of 3 decades in the British Army, "I believe there may be some confusion about military protocols. Our soldiers render honors according to British regulations and the chain of command established by Her Majesty's government. Perhaps I could arrange for a briefing that would clarify how our system operates." It was a perfectly diplomatic response that offered a face-saving way out of the confrontation, but Don Jr. seemed determined to push the issue. His inability to immediately get what he wanted was clearly frustrating him, and that frustration was beginning to override his diplomatic instincts. "There's no confusion here," Don Jr. replied sharply. "I'm asking for a simple salute from a soldier. This isn't complicated. Either British soldiers show respect to American representatives or they don't. Which is it?" The question was phrased in a way that made it nearly impossible to answer diplomatically. It forced the British officials to choose between compromising their military protocols or appearing to show disrespect to an American representative. It was exactly the kind of binary thinking that often led to diplomatic disasters. Captain Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice still perfectly professional, but with an undertone of steel that suggested his patience was being tested. "Sir, I show respect through proper military bearing and adherence to the regulations I have sworn to uphold. Those regulations do not authorize me to render military honors to visiting civilians, regardless of their nationality or political connections." The response was a masterpiece of military diplomacy, acknowledging respect while firmly maintaining the boundaries that governed British military conduct. But it was also exactly the kind of principled stand that was likely to further inflame someone who was already feeling publicly challenged. Don Jr.'s face flushed slightly as he realized that he was not going to get the compliance he had expected. The situation was becoming increasingly public, with palace staff and security personnel watching an American representative being politely but firmly denied what he considered to be a reasonable request. "This is unbelievable," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ceremonial grounds. "We're supposed to be allies, but apparently British soldiers can't be bothered to show basic courtesy to Americans." The comment revealed how completely he had misunderstood the nature of the situation. What he saw as discourtesy, the British saw as proper adherence to military discipline. What he interpreted as disrespect, they viewed as respect for the institutional structures that governed military conduct. As the standoff continued, everyone present could sense that they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this single morning. The careful relationships between nations often depended on mutual understanding and respect for each other's systems and traditions. When those systems clashed, as they were doing now, the results could affect diplomatic relations for years to come. Word of the confrontation was spreading through Buckingham Palace, with the speed that only comes when protocol staff realize that their carefully orchestrated event is going completely off the rails. In the private apartments, senior members of the royal household were receiving urgent updates about the situation unfolding on the ceremonial grounds, and the responses were a mixture of concern, disbelief, and barely contained exasperation. Lady Catherine Ashworth, the Queen's private secretary, received the call just as she was reviewing the final preparations for the state dinner. Her 25 years of managing royal events had prepared her for many contingencies, but an American representative demanding military honors from the Queen's Guard was not among the scenarios they had planned for. "He's asking for what exactly?" she said into the phone, her usually unflappable demeanor showing the first signs of strain. The answer confirmed her worst fears about what kind of diplomatic incident they were dealing with. She immediately began making calls to the Foreign Office, knowing that this situation would require coordination at levels far above the palace protocol staff. Meanwhile, in the American embassy across London, Ambassador Jonathan Mitchell was receiving his own frantic phone calls about the developing situation. His staff had been monitoring the palace visit through normal diplomatic channels, but the reports he was now receiving suggested that something had gone seriously wrong with what should have been a routine ceremonial appearance. "Tell me again exactly what happened," Ambassador Mitchell said to his deputy, hoping that the initial reports had been exaggerated. When the story was repeated with the same disturbing details, he realized that they were facing exactly the kind of diplomatic embarrassment that could damage relationships between two of the world's closest allies. Back at the palace, Don Jr. was beginning to realize that his usual tactics were not working, but instead of backing down, he seemed to be doubling down on his position. The growing audience of British officials was clearly not intimidating him. If anything, it seemed to be reinforcing his belief that this was a matter of principle that required his continued attention. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the relationship between our countries," Don Jr. continued, addressing his comments now to Colonel Richardson rather than the individual soldier. "When America sends a representative to Britain, we expect that representative to be treated with the same respect that we show to British officials when they visit America." Colonel Richardson, drawing on decades of experience in dealing with difficult situations, maintained his diplomatic composure while internally calculating the potential consequences of each possible response. He understood that this American visitor genuinely believed he was entitled to military honors, and that his frustration came from what he perceived as unreasonable resistance to a legitimate request. "Mr. Trump," the colonel replied carefully, "I can assure you that you are being treated with the utmost respect, consistent with British military protocols. Our soldiers are trained to honor the traditions and regulations that have guided the Queen's Guard for generations. These traditions include very specific guidelines about when and how military honors are rendered." The explanation was accurate and diplomatically phrased, but it failed to address Don Jr.'s fundamental assumption that his status as a representative of the American government should override those local protocols. His worldview had been shaped by a lifetime of expecting special treatment, and the polite but firm resistance he was encountering was challenging. Everything he believed about how international relations should work, Sir Reginald Pemberton was becoming increasingly desperate to find a solution that would satisfy the American visitor without compromising British military discipline. He had seen similar cultural misunderstandings before, but usually they could be resolved through quiet explanations and gentle redirections. This situation was proving to be significantly more difficult because the Americans seemed determined to make it a matter of principle. "Perhaps," Sir Reginald suggested hopefully, "we might arrange for a ceremonial inspection where you could review the Guard in your capacity as an official representative. That would be consistent with diplomatic protocol while allowing you to interact with our soldiers in a formal capacity." It was a creative compromise that would give Don Jr. a ceremonial role without requiring the Guards to violate their regulations about military salutes. But the American representative seemed to view any alternative to his original request as a form of defeat, rather than a diplomatic solution. "I didn't ask for an inspection," Don Jr. replied impatiently. "I asked for a salute. It's a simple gesture of respect between allies. Why is this so difficult to understand?" The question revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about how military protocols functioned outside the American system. He seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why a soldier would not comply with what he considered to be a reasonable request from a legitimate authority figure. Captain Whitmore, still standing at attention throughout this extended exchange, was beginning to attract sympathetic glances from palace staff who recognized the impossible position he had been placed in. His perfect military bearing was unchanged, but those who knew military discipline could see the strain of maintaining professionalism while being pressed to violate the very regulations that defined his service. The American security detail accompanying Don Jr. was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. They had experience with their principals sometimes demanding behavior, but they also understood enough about international protocol to recognize that this situation was heading in a problematic direction. However, their role was to provide security, not diplomatic advice, and they had no choice but to watch the confrontation unfold. As the standoff continued, the carefully planned schedule for the day was being completely disrupted. Other dignitaries who were supposed to participate in the ceremonies were being quietly informed that there would be delays, and contingency plans were being activated to minimize the damage to the overall diplomatic visit. In the private offices of Buckingham Palace, senior staff were having urgent consultations about how to proceed. The situation was unprecedented in their experience, and the potential for lasting diplomatic damage was becoming increasingly clear. They needed to find a solution that would satisfy American expectations without setting a precedent that would undermine British military traditions. The morning that had begun with such promise was turning into the kind of diplomatic nightmare that would be studied in international relations courses for years to come. The situation had reached a critical point where something had to give. Don Jr. stood facing Captain Whitmore with an expression that mixed determination with growing anger. While the British soldier maintained his perfect military bearing, despite the unprecedented pressure he was under, the assembled officials from both countries watched anxiously, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether this incident would be quietly resolved or would explode into an international embarrassment. Colonel Richardson made one final attempt at diplomatic intervention. "Mr. Trump, I believe I can arrange for you to meet with senior military officials who can explain our protocol systems in detail. Perhaps after that discussion, we can find a way to address your concerns that would be satisfactory to all parties." But Don Jr. had clearly decided that this was no longer about protocol or understanding different systems. In his mind, this had become a test of whether British soldiers would show proper respect to American authority, and he was not prepared to accept anything less than complete compliance with his original demand. "Colonel, I'm going to make this very simple," Don Jr. said, his voice taking on the kind of hard edge that his business associates would have recognized as a sign that negotiation time was over. "I want that soldier to salute me right now, or I'm going to consider this a deliberate insult to the United States of America and to my father's administration." The ultimatum hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. By framing his personal demand in terms of national honor and presidential authority, Don Jr. had escalated the situation beyond what any of the British officials had anticipated. What had begun as a cultural misunderstanding was now being presented as a potential diplomatic crisis. Captain Whitmore felt the weight of representing not just his own military service, but centuries of British military tradition. Every eye was on him, waiting to see whether he would bow to pressure or maintain the principles that had guided the Queen's Guard through wars, political upheavals, and countless challenges to their integrity. Sir Reginald Pemberton realized with growing horror that they were witnessing the kind of moment that could define diplomatic relationships for years to come. The American representative was essentially demanding that a British soldier violate his military oath in order to satisfy what amounted to a personal preference. The implications of either compliance or continued refusal were equally disturbing. "Mr. Trump," Sir Reginald said desperately, "surely we can find a solution that respects both American dignity and British military traditions. Perhaps we could arrange for a different kind of ceremonial recognition that would be consistent with both of our systems." Don Jr. turned his attention to the diplomatic officer with an expression that suggested his patience was completely exhausted. "Sir Reginald, I'm not interested in alternatives or compromises. I'm interested in basic respect. That soldier is going to salute me, or we're going to have a serious problem between our countries." The threat was unmistakable, and it represented exactly the kind of diplomatic brinksmanship that professional diplomats spent their careers trying to avoid. By linking his personal demand to broader international relations, Don Jr. was forcing everyone present to choose between satisfying his ego and maintaining their institutional integrity. Captain Whitmore finally spoke, his voice steady despite the enormous pressure he was under. "Sir, I have served my country honorably for 8 years. I have followed orders in combat zones where my life was at risk. I have never violated my military oath, and I will not begin today. I cannot and will not render military honors except as authorized by British military regulations and my chain of command." The response was everything that military training and personal honor demanded. But it was also exactly what Don Jr. did not want to hear. The American's face darkened as he realized that his ultimatum had been definitively rejected by a soldier who was prepared to face the consequences rather than compromise his principles. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Don Jr. said, his voice rising to a level that carried clearly across the palace grounds. "I am representing the President of the United States, and this soldier is showing deliberate disrespect to America and to my family. This incident will have consequences." Colonel Richardson stepped forward, his own military bearing evident as he addressed the American representative directly. "Mr. Trump, Captain Whitmore is one of the finest soldiers in the British Army. His conduct today has been exemplary, and his adherence to military discipline is exactly what we expect from the Queen's Guard. If there are diplomatic concerns about protocol, those should be addressed through appropriate channels, not by pressuring individual soldiers to violate their oaths." It was a masterful response that defended his subordinate, while offering a path forward for resolving the broader diplomatic implications. But it was also a clear statement that the British military would not compromise its standards to satisfy American political pressure. Don Jr. looked around at the faces of the British officials, perhaps finally beginning to understand that his usual methods of getting his way were not going to work in this environment. The polite but inflexible resistance he was encountering was something entirely outside his experience, and his frustration was evident to everyone present. "This is going to be reported to the highest levels of the American government," he said, making what was clearly intended as a threat. "My father will hear about this treatment, and so will the Secretary of State. You people have made a serious mistake today." The threat revealed how completely he had misunderstood the nature of the situation. What he saw as mistreatment, the British saw as proper adherence to military discipline. What he interpreted as disrespect to America, they viewed as respect for the institutional structures that governed civilized military conduct. As the confrontation reached its climax, everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The question was no longer whether this would become a diplomatic incident, but rather how serious the consequences would be. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a flurry of urgent phone calls and hastily arranged meetings as both governments tried to assess the damage and determine how to respond to what was rapidly becoming a significant diplomatic incident. Don Jr. had stormed away from the palace grounds with his security detail in tow, leaving behind a trail of shocked British officials and a very relieved Captain Whitmore who had maintained his principles under extraordinary pressure. Within hours, the story began to leak to the press, though the initial reports were confused and contradictory. British tabloids led with headlines about American arrogance, while American media initially focused on what they described as British rudeness toward a presidential representative. The truth, as is often the case with international incidents, was more complex than either side's initial spin suggested. Ambassador Mitchell found himself in the unenviable position of trying to explain to Washington why a routine ceremonial visit had exploded into a diplomatic crisis. His carefully worded cables to the State Department attempted to provide context about British military protocols while acknowledging that the American representative had been frustrated by what he perceived as unreasonable resistance to a simple request. "The fundamental issue," Ambassador Mitchell wrote in his confidential report, "appears to be a complete misunderstanding of how military honors are awarded within the British system. Mr. Trump Jr. seemed to believe that his status as a presidential representative entitled him to military courtesies that are simply not provided to civilian officials under British regulations." The response from Washington was swift and decidedly unsympathetic to Don Jr.'s position. Secretary of State Pompeo's office issued a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in the professionalism of British military personnel and emphasizing the strong relationship between American and British forces. The statement was diplomatic enough to avoid directly criticizing Don Jr., but it clearly indicated that the administration was not prepared to support his demands. At Buckingham Palace, the royal household was conducting its own damage assessment. The incident had disrupted the entire day's schedule and had created exactly the kind of international controversy that the palace worked diligently to avoid. However, there was also a sense of quiet pride in how Captain Whitmore and the other military personnel had handled themselves under pressure. The captain's conduct was exemplary, Colonel Richardson reported to his superiors. He maintained military discipline and courtesy throughout an extremely difficult situation. He never showed disrespect to the American representative, but he also never compromised the standards we expect from the Queen's Guard. Captain Whitmore himself was dealing with the sudden attention in the way that professional soldiers typically handle unexpected fame, by trying to continue with his duties and hoping that the media interest would fade quickly. His fellow guards treated him with the respect due to someone who had faced a difficult test and passed with honor. But the entire regiment was aware that their actions were now under increased scrutiny. The diplomatic implications of the incident extended far beyond the immediate embarrassment. British officials were concerned about what the confrontation revealed about American understanding of Allied military protocols, while American diplomats worried about the precedent of allowing foreign military regulations to override what they saw as reasonable requests for courtesy. In the days following the incident, both governments worked quietly to minimize the damage. British officials emphasized their continued commitment to the special relationship between the two countries, while American representatives acknowledged the importance of respecting local customs and protocols during international visits. However, the story had taken on a life of its own in international media. Editorial writers used the incident to explore broader themes about American attitudes toward international institutions, British adherence to tradition, and the challenges of maintaining diplomatic relationships in an era of increasingly polarized politics. Don Jr. himself seemed surprised by the negative reaction his behavior had generated. In interviews with friendly media outlets, he insisted that he had simply been seeking appropriate respect for American leadership, and that the British response had been unnecessarily rigid and disrespectful. "All I wanted was a simple salute," he told a conservative news program. "It's basic military courtesy. The fact that they refuse such a simple request tells you everything you need to know about how they really feel about America and about my father's presidency." Comment revealed that he still did not understand why the British soldiers had been unable to comply with his request, and that he continued to view their adherence to military regulations as a personal slight rather than a matter of institutional integrity. British military leaders, meanwhile, used the incident as an opportunity to educate both their own personnel and international visitors about the principles that governed military conduct. They emphasized that military honors were not arbitrary gestures of personal respect, but formal recognitions that followed specific protocols, designed to maintain military discipline and institutional integrity. The long-term impact of the incident was felt primarily in diplomatic and military circles, where it became a cautionary tale about the importance of cultural preparation before international visits. Both American and British officials began including more detailed briefings about military protocols and ceremonial procedures in their preparation materials for high-level visits. For Captain Whitmore, the incident became a defining moment in his military career. He had faced a test of his professional integrity under extraordinary pressure and had maintained the standards expected of the Queen's Guard. His conduct became a case study in military academies about the importance of adhering to regulations and chain of command even when facing political pressure. The broader lesson of the incident was about the complexity of international relations and the importance of understanding and respecting the institutional structures that govern different countries, military and diplomatic practices. What seemed like a simple request for courtesy had revealed deep differences in how military honor and civilian authority were understood in different national contexts. Years later, the incident at Buckingham Palace had become the stuff of legend in both diplomatic and military circles, though the lessons drawn from it varied significantly depending on who was telling the story. What everyone agreed on was that it represented a perfect example of how cultural misunderstandings could escalate into international incidents when pride and protocol collided. Captain Whitmore had gone on to have a distinguished military career, eventually retiring with honors and taking a position training new officers in military protocol and international relations. He rarely spoke publicly about that morning at Buckingham Palace, but when he did, it was always in the context of emphasizing the importance of maintaining military discipline, regardless of external pressures. The moment you start compromising military regulations for political convenience, he would tell his students, you undermine the very foundations that make military service meaningful. A soldier's oath is not conditional on whether civilian officials approve of military traditions. His words carried extra weight because everyone knew about his experience facing political pressure at the highest levels and maintaining his integrity despite significant personal and professional risks. The incident had made him something of a hero within British military circles, though he always emphasized that he had simply done what any properly trained soldier should have done in the same situation. Don Jr., for his part, seemed to have learned different lessons from the experience. In subsequent international visits, his behavior suggested that he had developed a better understanding of diplomatic protocol, though whether this reflected genuine learning or simply more careful preparation by his staff remained a matter of debate among diplomatic observers. The incident had also prompted significant changes in how both American and British officials prepared for high-level visits. Protocol briefings became more detailed and more explicit about the differences between American and international military customs. Cultural attachés began spending more time explaining why certain requests that seemed reasonable in one context might be inappropriate in another. Ambassador Mitchell, who had spent considerable time cleaning up the diplomatic mess created by the confrontation, used the experience to advocate for more comprehensive cultural training for American officials traveling abroad. Understanding protocol isn't just about following rules, he argued in a widely read article about diplomatic preparation. It's about showing respect for the institutions and traditions that define other countries' national identity. The British Foreign Office conducted its own review of the incident and concluded that while their personnel had handled the situation correctly, there might have been opportunities for earlier intervention that could have prevented the confrontation from escalating. They implemented new procedures for managing cultural misunderstandings during ceremonial events, including designated protocol officers specifically trained to handle awkward requests from visiting dignitaries. In academic circles, the incident became a case study in international relations courses, used to illustrate how personal assumptions about authority and respect could clash with institutional traditions and formal protocols. Students analyzed the different perspectives of each participant and debated whether alternative approaches might have led to better outcomes for all involved. The media attention surrounding the incident had largely faded within a few months, but it had left lasting impressions on everyone who had witnessed it. Palace staff developed new appreciation for the importance of clear communication about expectations and limitations during international visits. Security personnel from both countries gained valuable experience in managing situations where political tensions intersected with ceremonial procedures. Perhaps most significantly, the incident highlighted the ongoing challenges of maintaining international relationships in an era of changing political leadership and evolving diplomatic norms. The traditional structures that had governed international protocol for centuries were increasingly being tested by leaders who brought different assumptions and expectations to diplomatic encounters. Colonel Richardson, reflecting on the incident several years later, observed that it had taught him valuable lessons about the intersection of military discipline and political pressure. "We learned that maintaining our standards isn't just about following rules," he noted. "It's about preserving the institutional integrity that allows military professionals to serve effectively regardless of political changes." The Queen's Guard continued to perform their ceremonial duties with the same precision and dedication that had characterized their service for centuries. The incident had, if anything, reinforced their commitment to maintaining the standards that made them respected around the world. Visitors to Buckingham Palace continued to be impressed by their discipline and bearing, though protocol officers now made sure that expectations were clearly communicated in advance. For Captain Whitmore, the lasting legacy of that morning was not the controversy it had generated, but the affirmation of the principles that had guided his military service. He had faced a test of his professional integrity and had emerged with his honor intact and his commitment to military excellence strengthened. The incident taught me that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing, he would reflect years later. But it also taught me that institutions built on solid principles can withstand political pressure if the people within them are willing to stand up for what they believe in. The story of that morning at Buckingham Palace became a reminder that in an increasingly connected world, understanding and respecting different cultural and institutional traditions wasn't just a matter of politeness. It was essential for maintaining the relationships that allowed nations to work together effectively on the challenges that faced them all.